Talmud actually also comes from the word lomed, lamad, which means to learn. But actually, there are two Talmuds. There's the Jerusalem Talmud that was actually put together in the year 400, and then there's another one which is the Babylonian Talmud, which was put together, I would say, it's not clear, maybe the 500, between 500 and 600 in some cases. There may even been additions after that. So it's not clear exactly. But what is the Talmud? The Talmud is the Mishnah, and the Mishnah is a text that was actually codified in the year 200. And it's basically a book of laws, but it's not really laws. It also has a great deal of morals. It has a great deal of teachings of that nature. And then what you have in both the Jerusalem and in the Babylonian context, you have commentaries on the Mishnah. Now, there are sections of the Mishnah to which there is no Talmudic commentary. But in a technical sense, Talmud is the Mishnah with its commentary. Now, the Babylonian Talmud is the one that is most usually and most universally used, and largely because Rashi wrote a commentary to the Babylonian Talmud, and he actually reads it for you. And that's a very, very helpful thing, to have someone who knows it backwards and forwards and who is able to deal with what are some of the problems that emerge in looking at it. Because apart from the fact that the language itself, it's Aramaic, but there's no grammar to Talmudic Aramaic as opposed to, say, biblical Aramaic. Not that there's that much biblical Aramaic, but there's no real grammar. I mean, I remember when I was studying Talmud, I had Jastro's 2-volume encyclopedia, a dictionary of the Mishnah and the Talmud and of Rabbinic Judaism, and it was very helpful. But, and so people really learn it. My professor, Professor Atlas, who was one of the great Talmudists of our time, he started learning it at the age of 3. And by the time he finished, he knew it by heart. I think you were dealing with about 66 volumes. It's a massive piece of work, massive piece of work. Now, what is in the Talmud? In the Talmud, it contains basically two types of literature. One would have to call halacha. And halacha comes from the word halach, which means to walk, a direction. It means the way one should proceed. And that is what has sometimes been referred to as the law. And then there's another, which is called Haggadah, which comes from the word higid, which means speech or, to tell, to speak, to tell. And that is much more associated, Midrash, Haggadah, is much more associated with everything else. Everything that is non-legal or halakhic, that may deal with God, it may deal with suffering, it may deal with stories, it may deal with anecdotes, it may deal with everything that one can imagine. The whole world is in there. The Bible is, in the Midrash, the Bible is repeated at least 3 times. The entire Bible is quoted. I mean, so, and the one thing you have to understand is that these rabbis were uncanny in terms of the kind of memory they had. They really were uncanny. I mean, they would take verses from everywhere, and they weren't looking them up. They had them in their heads. I know because I experienced that with Dr. Atlas. I mean, he just had a complete command of the total literature. And in fact, what happens, of course, is that you have no clear idea what actually the law is from the Talmud. You just don't know. And after the Talmud, what you had is you had these schools and these academies where people would go with questions. And so what you had is a whole literature, which is called responsa literature, which were the responses that were the respondents to particular questions dealing with practice. You also had the problem that in different communities, keep in mind, the Talmud came out of Babylonia, but you had communities, Jewish communities all over the world. And how are you going to apply these this teaching these various contexts, and so you had academies that would actually take these questions and respond these questions, and this goes on to this very day. So that today you have a whole series of responsa literature. Like, remember, we had a fellow, Rabbi Bleich, who is a very famous halachist, a very famous Jewish scholar, who actually has written books and books and books on the responsa, where people ask him questions. What do you do? Because it wasn't clear. Now, because of that, you had an attempt to distinguish the legal aspects of the Talmud from the Midrashic. And so you can find, then you have the Beit Yosef, which was a collection of the Midrashic, and then you have another collection of the lawful or the halakhic. But law is too narrow. You can't really call it law. It's not like you have a law the way you would have it in let's say, if you look at the law of the United States, where you have these laws, and so no, it's much, much broader, much. And then what you had was an attempt, like, what do you do with all this? Now, the greatness of Moses Maimonides, and in this respect, he was probably the most famous and most important Jewish. That's why they say from Moses to Moses, there was none like Moses. So from Moses, who gave the Torah, to Moses Maimonides, who wrote the Mishnah Torah, which is a repetition or a second Torah, there was no one, and that's true, there was no one comparable. So what actually Maimonides says in the introduction to his Mishnah Torah is, if you have the Torah of Moses and you have my Mishnah Torah, you don't need anything else. You don't need to study the Talmud, because it's all there. And of course, and he never gave sources. So he thought the reason he didn't give sources is that you wouldn't have to worry about it. But then what grew out of that was hundreds of commentaries on the Mishnah Torah. So now I have this, I think I can show you. I have a copy of the Mishnah Torah where all around it are all the commentaries on it. And so what you have is massive. It's massive. And when you think that a rabbi knows this, that's nonsense. I mean, if a person specializes in it and he spends 30 or 40 years at it, he may have an inkling of it. But it's absurd to think that somehow, people come to me and say, oh, you're a rabbi. So I said, I turn around, who are you talking to? You're not talking to me because I don't know it. It's too difficult. It's like, well, I studied addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. Therefore, I should be able to do the tensor calculus. I'm sorry. I can't even go near the tensor calculus. And most rabbis are at the level of addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. They're not at the level of the calculus when it comes to Talmud. Talmud is tough.